Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Welcome to lecture 12 of our lectures about grammatical rules and systems. In this lecture we'll talk about subordination. In the previous lecture we already talked about coordination, and if you remember in lecture 1 we said we have different types of sentences. So we have simple sentences, we have compound sentences, and we have complex sentences. So simple sentences, they only have one clause. Compound sentences, they have more than one clause and they are joined together by a coordinator or a coordinating conjunction. And the third case, or the third type, complex sentences, these are joined together by a subordinator. So in this case we will talk about complex sentences and subordination. A complex sentence has two or more clauses and is joined by a subordinating conjunction, or what we call a subordinator. At least one of these clauses is subordinate, so it is dependent. Subordinate means the same thing as dependent to a main clause. So it is dependent on a main clause, or it is a subordinate to a main clause. It comes under it. It is part of a main clause. So we will give the definition of main clauses. A main clause, also known as an independent clause, is a clause that can stand alone as a complete sentence. So it can be alone, it can function as a complete sentence on its own, independent of any other clause. So it doesn't need any other clause to come in a sentence or in a grammatical sentence. But subordinate clauses, which we also call dependent clauses, they cannot stand alone. They must be added to a main clause. So they must be part of a main clause if they want to become part of a sentence, but they cannot come alone as a complete sentence. So this is the difference between main clauses, subordinate clauses, or we can also call them independent clauses and dependent clauses. A clause can be subordinate by being able to do one of the following. So if a clause can do one of the following, it can be called a subordinate clause. In number one, or the first thing that they can do, or they must be able to do, is replace an MP in the main clause. So if they can replace, or if a clause can replace an MP in the main clause, we call this clause a subordinate clause. So for example, everyone could see it. It here is a pronoun. Okay, so it is an MP. If you remember, pronouns are part of what we call MPs. And in this sentence here, we can remove it and put a clause in its place. For example, everyone could see that he was frightened. That he was frightened, it replaces it in the first sentence. So it takes the place of an MP in the main clause. That he was frightened is called a subordinate clause. So the subordinate clause, that he was frightened, is a noun clause. Okay, it took the place of an MP, of a noun phrase. So a noun clause can take the place of a noun phrase. It functions as the object of the verb see. So in the first sentence, everyone could see it. It is the object of the verb see. And everyone could see that he was frightened. That he was frightened, this clause, this subordinate clause, is also the object of the verb see. So it can function, it can have grammatical functions similar to the MP. So it can be an object in this case. And we will look at different functions of subordinate clauses in a few minutes. So here we have, just focus that we have a subordinate clause started or introduced with a subordinator or subordinating conjunction, which is in this case that. So that is a subordinating conjunction, and that he was frightened is a subordinate clause, or what we call a dependent clause. It is dependent on the main clause, everyone could see it. Okay? We also can have subordinate clauses that modify an MP in the main clause. For example, I often see my old school friends. Friends is an MP, and it is the head of the noun phrase, my old school friends. My and old and school, these three are modifiers. They are pre-modifiers. They modify the head friends. We can take out these three modifiers and use a clause instead. Okay, so we can use a subordinate clause to modify the head friends. So we can say I often see friends who were at school with me. Friends who were at school with me. You notice who were at school with me modifies the MP friends. So it can modify the MP friends, which is in the main clause. I often see friends, so this is the main clause here, who were at school with me. This is the subordinate clause, and in this case the subordinate clause modifies the main clause, or modifies the MP in the main clause. We also can replace an adverbial in the main clause with a subordinate clause. So for example, I met Ahmed 20 years ago. 20 years ago is an adverbial. It gives us time, so it is an adverbial of time. We can take it out and we can put a subordinate clause in its place. So we can say I met Ahmed when I was at school. When I was at school is a subordinate clause, and in this case it is the replacement of an adverbial of time. So we can call it an adverbial clause of time. So when I was at school is an adverbial clause of time, and it functions as what? An adjunct. I remember adjuncts, they are optional, they can be removed. So adverbials, they can mostly be adjuncts. So I met Ahmed, this is a complete sentence. But when you say 20 years ago, we added more information. So I met Ahmed 20 years ago. More information, it is optional, you can remove it. And this is the same case with the subordinate clause. We can say I met Ahmed, and we finish the sentence, it is complete. We can also say I met Ahmed when I was at school, to add more, to add an optional part to this sentence. When I was at school, here is a subordinate clause, and it functions as an adjunct, and it is an adverbial clause of time. A subordinate clause is usually introduced, it begins with one of the following. Number one, a subordinating conjunction, like when or that, or also a correlative subordinating conjunction. We will see examples of both in this lecture and the next lecture. And two, a relative pronoun, like who, which, or whose. We will discuss relative pronouns and relative clauses in detail in the next lecture. But first here, let's compare these two cases. Number one, he was frightened. Number two, that he was frightened. Or number two, I was at school. And look at number 1b. Number 1b, that he was frightened, and number 2b, when I was at school. So 1a, he was frightened, this is a full sentence. It is a complete sentence, and it is an independent clause. In number 1b, that he was frightened, this is not an independent clause. It cannot come alone as a full sentence. It is subordinate or dependent. It is dependent on another clause that must be added to. So we need to add that he was frightened to another clause, to a main clause, to appear as a full sentence. So in number 1a, he was frightened, this is a full sentence, it is complete, it is independent, and this is a grammatical sentence. But in number 1b, that he was frightened, this is only part of a sentence. Okay, it needs to be added to a main clause to be complete. So we call this a subordinate or a dependent clause. Look at number 2a, I was at school, and number 2b, when I was at school. So number 2a, I was at school, this is a full sentence, it is a complete sentence, and the clause here is independent. It doesn't need to be added or to be part of any other clause. But in number 2b, when I was at school, here this is a subordinate clause or a dependent clause. So it needs to be added to another clause to form a complete sentence. And this is just restating what I just said. 1a and 1b are independent, they are complete sentences by themselves. 1b and 2b are subordinate clauses. They are not complete sentences on their own. They must be added to a main clause if we want to make a complete sentence out of them. Let's look at this exercise. Decide whether the underlined clause is A, dependent, or B, independent. In number 1, it was obvious to everyone that he wanted to leave. The underlined clause here is that he wanted to leave. So that he wanted to leave is what? Is it dependent or independent? Can we take it out alone as a full sentence? No. So it is dependent. It must be added to a main clause. In this case, the main clause, it was obvious to everyone. And that he wanted to leave is a subordinate clause, of course. So it is dependent. The correct choice for number 1 is A, dependent. Number 2, he wanted to leave, and this was obvious to everyone. Here we have he wanted to leave. If you notice, it is similar to number 1. But here, we don't have a subordinator before it. We don't have a subordinating conjunction before it. So he wanted to leave. In this case, this is independent. Okay, it doesn't need to be added to any other clause to be complete. So we can say he wanted to leave, and we end the sentence. That's okay. We can also use a coordinator like and to add it to another clause. And in this case, both clauses are independent. So this was obvious to everyone. This is also an independent clause. So in number 2, he wanted to leave. This is an independent clause. The correct answer for number 2 is B. Number 3, my friends came to visit me when I was in Dammam. When I was in Dammam, it starts with a subordinator, a subordinating conjunction, and it cannot appear alone, so it is dependent. It is dependent on the main clause, so the answer for number 3 is A, dependent. Number 4, my friends came to visit me, but I was in Dammam. I was in Dammam. This clause can appear alone as a full sentence, but here is a coordinator. So as we said before, if we have a coordinator coordinating two clauses, we can both clauses are independent. Okay, so the first one is independent and the second one is independent. My friends came to visit me, this is independent, and I was in Dammam is also independent. So in this sentence, the correct choice for number 4 is B. B is the correct choice. We have different types of subordinate clauses. We have noun clauses, relative clauses, adverbial clauses, and other ones like conditional clauses, result clauses, and purpose clauses. We will take a look at each of these types, but first we will start with the noun clauses in this lecture. So, noun clauses. We can divide noun clauses into that clauses and WH clauses. And from their name, a that clause begins with that, and a WH clause begins with a WH word, like what or who. So what, who, they begin with WH. We call these WH question words. So two types of noun clauses, that clauses and WH clauses. We will start with that clauses. A that clause can have 4 functions. We will talk about the functions of the that clause. So they can have 4 of the functions of the MP. You remember we talked about the functions of the MP, of the noun phrase. That clauses can have the same functions or 4 of the same functions of the MP. It can be, number 1, the subject of a verb in another clause. So if we have that clause, it can be the subject of a verb in another clause. So, that the driver could not control his car. This is a subordinate clause. Is obvious. You notice we can take out the whole subordinate clause and replace it with it, with the pronoun it. So that the driver could not control his car is obvious. We can say it is obvious, or this thing is obvious. This subordinate clause is the subject. Okay, so that the driver could not control his car, this is the subject, and then is, this is the verb to be, and obvious is the complement. Okay, so the subordinate clause in this sentence is the subject. In this case, that is obligatory. We cannot delete that. We cannot say that the driver could not control his car is obvious. This is not correct. We need that to be in the clause or in the subordinate clause. We cannot remove it. It is not optional. It is obligatory. Another function of the noun clause, or of that clauses in particular, is that they can be the object of a verb in another clause. Everyone could see that he was frightened. Here we have the verb see, and it takes an object. So for example, if you have everyone could see it, it is the object of the verb see, and we can replace it with a subordinate clause. In this case, everyone could see that he was frightened. That he was frightened here is the object of the verb see. Note that is optional here. So that is optional in this sentence. So we can say everyone could see he was frightened. That can be removed, and this is why I put it between two brackets. Okay, so everyone could see that he was frightened. That, the subordinator here, can be removed. We can say everyone could see he was frightened. It is optional. It is not obligatory. And number 3, the third function of the noun clause, or of that clauses in particular, complement of subject plus the verb to be. You remember that we discussed complements more than once previously, so we discussed it a lot of times. Complements are necessary. They are not optional. They are necessary for the completion of meaning, and we need them in the sentence to be complete. For example, the truth is that he was very shy. We can say the truth is this, okay? So this here is an MP, so the truth is this. This can be replaced with the truth is that he was very shy. That he was very shy, here it is the complement of the subject, the truth, and the verb to be is. So that he was very shy is a complement. That is optional in this sentence, and we can delete it. So we can say the truth is he was very shy. We can remove that from this sentence, and it will be correct. So it is optional. That is optional, and it can be removed if you want. The fourth function of that clauses is a position, or as an appositive to nouns like fact, truth, and explanation. We discussed apposition before. We said if we have two MPs that follow each other and they both refer to the same person or the same thing, there is nothing between them, there is no conjunction between them, they follow each other directly, these are called apposition, okay, or appositive. We can also have apposition with a noun phrase and a noun clause, as in the example, the fact that he was shy surprised me. The fact is a noun phrase, that he was shy is a noun clause. It is a that clause, one of the types of noun clauses, and they are both referred to the same thing. They are the fact and that he was shy. These are two things, one phrase and one clause that refer to the same thing. Okay, so the fact that he was shy is the fact. So we're talking about the same thing here. That he was shy is an appositive noun clause. So it is a subordinate clause, a noun clause, and it is an appositive. It refers to the same thing as the MP, the fact. We say that the noun clause, that he was shy, is in opposition to the MP, the fact. And in this case, that it can be deleted. Okay, it sometimes can be deleted, but it is mostly kept here. So the fact that he was shy surprised me, we can remove it. The fact he was shy surprised me, it's okay, but it is mostly kept. Reported speech. This is something related to that clauses. Reported speech can be either direct or indirect. So direct speech is quoting the actual words spoken by someone. So if someone says something and you quote the actual words he said, word for word, you don't change anything, this is called direct speech. So you are reporting direct speech. In this case, we need to use quotation marks like the ones you have here. So the sentence, the quoted sentence, is placed between quotation marks. Compare this with indirect speech. Indirect speech is restating the words. We change them. Okay, so we restate the words spoken by someone, and we use a that clause to restate them, to say them again. In this case, we don't need quotation marks. And here we'll see some examples. In the first example here, the man says the road is closed. The road is closed is exactly what the man said. So this is what the man says. This is exactly what he says, and it is placed between quotation marks. This is called direct speech using quotation marks. We have another example. The man says that the road is closed. Compare the two. The man says that the road is closed. Here we have indirect speech. We restated what the man says, and we used a that clause to do so. So we can use that clauses, we can use subordinate clauses to restate or report indirect speech. Okay, so this is what we need to understand. We can use that clauses as an example of subordinate clauses to restate speech, okay, to restate direct speech in the form of indirect speech. Alright, so this is what is related to our discussion our discussion topic in this lecture. Alright, so we are done with that clauses. Now we move on to WH clauses, which is another type of noun clauses. A WH clause can have 4 of the functions of an MP. So we'll talk again about the functions. In this case, we are talking about the functions of WH clauses. So a WH clause can be, number 1, the subject of another clause. So for example, what caused the accident is a complete mystery. What caused the accident is the subject in this sentence. We can remove it and replace it with a pronoun like it. So it is a complete mystery. It and what caused the accident are both subjects. So, okay, so what caused the accident is a complete mystery. What caused the accident is a subject, and it is a complete mystery. It is a subject as well. So this is the first function, the subject of another clause. The second function, the object of a verb in another clause. No one knows what caused the accident. Knows is the verb, and it needs an object. So no one knows this thing. Okay, it needs a direct object. In this case, we used a subordinate clause, a WH clause, to form or to give the object of the verb. So no one knows what caused the accident. We can say no one knows it, or no one knows that. So we can replace it with an MP. What caused the accident is a subordinate clause, a WH clause, which is one of the types of noun clauses, and it is the object of the verb knows. The third function, the complement of subject plus the verb to be. Here we have the question. This is the subject, is, this is the verb to be. What caused the accident is the complement, and we can say the question is this. We can replace it with this. Okay, instead of saying the question is what caused the accident, we can replace it with an MP like this. So the question is what caused the accident. Here this is a complement. In number 4, the object of a preposition, and this is the different function between WH clauses and that clauses. That clauses can function as appositives. WH clauses can function as objects of a preposition. This, of course, depends on what you want. This is a sentence here. This depends on what you want. On is a preposition. What you want is the object of the preposition on. We can say this depends on it. It is also the object of the preposition on. So in this sentence, this depends on what you want. What you want is a subordinate clause, and it is the object of the preposition on. Let's do this exercise quickly. What is the function of the underlined clause? If it is a subject, choose A. If it is an object, choose B. If it is a complement, choose C. And if it is a positive, choose D. In the case of object, it can either be the object of a verb or the object of a preposition. In number 1, the fact is that no one could do it. You should know this by now. We have the subject, the fact. We have the verb to be, is. And of course, we need a complement after these two. So that no one could do it is the complement of the subject plus the verb to be. The correct choice for number 1 is C. That clause in this sentence is a complement. Number 2, what he discovered was important for science. We can remove what he discovered and say it. It was important for science. And what he discovered then is a subject. Okay, so it is a subject, and the answer then is A. In number 2, the answer is A. It is the subject of this sentence. What he discovered was important. This is WH clause functioning as a subject. In number 3, the fact that no one could do it disappointed me. The fact is an MP. That no one could do it is a noun clause, and here the noun clause refers to the same thing as the noun phrase, the MP, and this is what we call an appositive. So number 3, that no one could do it is an appositive. It is in opposition to the MP de facto. In number 4, everyone knows that he made a great discovery. We can say everyone knows it. Knows needs an object. It needs a direct object. So everyone knows it. It is the object, and so is the that clause, that he made a great discovery. It is also an object. It is the object of the verb knows. So the correct choice for number 4 is B. Number 5, the workers rely on what the manager has to say. What the manager has to say comes after a preposition, on, and it is in this case the object of the preposition. So what the manager has to say, we can say the workers rely on it. On it. It here is the object of the preposition on, and it's what the manager has to say. The WH clause is also the object of the preposition on. Alright, so this is the end of our lecture. We will continue our discussion about subordination in the next lecture, which will be the final lecture of the topics we will cover. And in lecture 14, we will take a look at some of the topics that might be confusing. We'll do some reviews, we will answer some questions. So I will see you then, inshallah. Thank you for listening.